Every year, headlines say the same thing. The military has a recruiting problem. Recruiters aren't working hard enough. Young people don't want to serve anymore. It's not true. The US military doesn't have a recruiting problem. It has an eligibility problem. And the difference matters. 77% of Americans between 17 and 24 cannot join the military. Not won't, cannot. They're medically, legally, or educationally disqualified before a recruiter ever talks to them. 1 in 3 are too heavy. 1 in 10 have criminal records that bar them from service. Millions more have anxiety diagnosis, ADHD prescriptions, or test scores too low to qualify. The recruiting pool isn't shrinking because young people lost interest. It's shrinking because America is producing fewer people who meet the requirements of military service. This is the story the headlines don't tell, and it has consequences that reach far beyond recruiting offices. The statistic. The 77% figure comes from the Pentagon's 2020 Qualified Military Available Study. It measured every American between 17 and 24 years old, the entire recruiting pool, and asked a simple question: how many of them could actually serve? The answer was 23%, less than 1 in 4. That was worse than the previous study in 2017, which found 71% ineligible. In 3 years, the number jumped 6 points in the wrong direction. The disqualifications break down into categories. 11% are disqualified for weight alone, too heavy to meet military body composition standards. 8% for drug or alcohol abuse, 7% for medical or physical health conditions, 4% for mental health, 1% each for low test scores, criminal records, and dependent status. But here's what makes the problem harder to solve. 44% of ineligible Americans are disqualified for multiple reasons. Not just overweight and failed a drug test. Not just anxiety and a criminal record and low test scores. The categories overlap, the problems compound, and the result is a shrinking pool that no amount of advertising can fix. Obesity, the largest disqualifier. The single biggest reason Americans can't join the military is weight. 1 in 3 adults, roughly 31 to 33%, are medically obese by Department of Defense standards. Not overweight, obese, too heavy to enlist without a waiver, and often too heavy to get a waiver approved. The military's body composition standards aren't arbitrary. For men, the maximum allowable body fat ranges from 20 to 26% depending on age. For women, 26 to 36%. These numbers exist because obesity correlates directly with training injuries, stress fractures, heat casualties, joint problems. This wasn't always the case. In World War II, the military's weight problem was the opposite. They screened out recruits who were underweight and malnourished. The concern was whether young men had enough body mass to endure combat. Between 1959 and 2008, the percentage of Americans disqualified for being too heavy doubled for men and tripled for women. Today, 22% of 12 to 19-year-olds are obese, compared to 5% in the 1970s. The costs extend beyond recruiting. 22% of active duty service members are now classified as obese, up 12% since 2020. The Navy has the highest rate at 27%. Obesity-related health care costs the Department of Defense an estimated $1.5 to $1.7 billion annually. The military has tried to adapt. The Army created the Future Soldier Preparatory Course, a program that gives recruits up to 90 days to lose weight before basic training. In fiscal year 2024, nearly a quarter of all Army enlistees came through that program. But a February 2025 Inspector General report found serious problems. 14% of trainees in one 4-month period exceeded even the expanded body fat limits. Some arrived 19% over the standard. 1/3 were separated immediately for being too overweight to participate. The IG found inadequate medical supervision, inconsistent dietitian access, and health risks from rapid weight loss. The prep course isn't a solution, it's a patch. And the patch is already showing cracks. Medical and mental health. The second largest category of disqualification is medical and mental health conditions. Combined, they account for roughly 20 to 25% of ineligible Americans, though the number is hard to pin down because many have multiple diagnoses. Some conditions are automatic disqualifiers: schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, insulin-dependent diabetes, severe asthma. These aren't judgment calls. They're medical realities that affect safety, deployability, and the ability to function in austere environments. But the growth in this category comes from something else: the rise in diagnosed anxiety, depression, and ADHD among young Americans. Between 2015 and 2019, 50,000 potential recruits were disqualified for mental health reasons alone. 39% of them requested waivers. 55% of those waivers were granted, meaning many of these people could serve, but only after a lengthy review process that most never complete. Here's the paradox. Society tells young people to seek help for mental health. Schools encourage it, parents encourage it. The military encourages it. But seeking help creates a medical record, and that record can disqualify you from service. A kid who sees a therapist at 15 for anxiety might be fine at 20, but the documentation follows them. A 2021 RAND Corporation study found that recruits who received waivers for behavioral health conditions performed no worse than their peers, and in some cases performed better. The study suggested that seeking treatment might actually be a sign of self-awareness and problem-solving, not weakness. But the waiver process is slow, inconsistent, and varies by branch. The same applicant might get approved at one recruiting station and denied at another. The system isn't designed to scale. Meanwhile, diagnosed anxiety and depression among young adults has increased 40 to 60% since 2000. The eligible pool keeps shrinking, not because more people are mentally ill, but because more people have documentation of conditions that may or may not affect their ability to serve. 8% of young Americans are disqualified for drug or alcohol abuse, another 1% for criminal records that bar them from service. The drug numbers are driven almost entirely by marijuana. 23 states have legalized recreational marijuana. 38 have legalized medical marijuana. Only 11 states prohibit all marijuana use. More than half of new recruits come from states where marijuana is at least medically legal. But federal law hasn't changed. The military is a federal institution bound by federal drug policy, and federal policy still classifies marijuana as a controlled substance. This creates a collision. A 19-year-old in Colorado can walk into a dispensary, buy marijuana legally, and use it without breaking any state law. But if they try to enlist 6 months later, that legal use can disqualify them, or at minimum require a waiver and a waiting period. Each branch handles it differently. The Army has granted over 3,000 waivers for marijuana use since 2018. The Navy stopped sending boot camp recruits home for positive marijuana tests in 2024, instead giving them a chance to retest. The Air Force runs a pilot program with a 90-day waiting period. But the inconsistency itself is the problem. Criminal records work similarly. Felony convictions are generally disqualifying, though waivers exist for nonviolent offenses. Domestic violence convictions are permanently disqualifying. Federal law prohibits anyone convicted of domestic violence from possessing a firearm, which makes military service impossible. The Army and National Guard are the most flexible with moral waivers. The Air Force and Coast Guard are the strictest. But across all branches, criminal history narrows the pool further. And here's the compounding factor. Drug use often leads to criminal records. Criminal records often correlate with lower education levels. Lower education correlates with lower test scores. The categories don't exist in isolation, they stack. Education and aptitude. The final major category is education and aptitude. About 10 to 11% of young Americans lack either a high school diploma or the test scores required to enlist. The military requires a high school diploma or GED for nearly all enlisted positions. But GED holders face stricter standards. The Army requires a minimum ASVAB score of 31 for diploma holders, but 50 for GED holders. The bigger issue is the ASVAB itself, the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery. It measures math, reading comprehension, and technical reasoning. The military uses it to determine which jobs a recruit qualifies for. Test scores have been declining nationwide for over a decade. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated this trend. Remote learning, school closures, and disrupted education left millions of students behind, and many of them are now reaching enlistment age. Modern military jobs require more than physical fitness. A reactor technician on a submarine needs to understand mathematics. An aviation electronics technician needs to read schematics. A cyber operations specialist needs problem-solving skills that didn't exist as job requirements 30 years ago. This isn't World War II. when the military could absorb large numbers of minimally educated recruits and train them for basic infantry roles. Today's force is smaller, more technical, and more dependent on individual competence. The standards exist because the jobs demand them. Why waivers don't scale? The obvious question is, why not just grant more waivers? The military does grant waivers, thousands of them every year. The Army alone approved over 3,000 marijuana waivers between 2018 and 2022. Felony waivers jumped from 98 in 2022 to over 400 in 2024. But waivers come with costs. First, attrition. Recruits who enter with waivers wash out of training at higher rates. They leave the military earlier. They require more supervision and intervention. The savings from filling a slot today become costs tomorrow when that recruit fails to complete their first enlistment. A recent analysis found that 25% of all recruits fail to complete their first contract. For recruits who come through prep courses or received multiple waivers, the rate is higher. Second, security clearances. Many military jobs require access to classified information. Background checks for clearances are thorough. Drug history, criminal history, mental health history, financial problems, all of it gets reviewed. A waiver to enlist doesn't guarantee a waiver for clearance. And without clearance, many technical jobs are off limits. Third, the process itself. Waivers require documentation, review, and approval. They take time. A motivated recruit might wait months for a decision, and in that time, they might find another job, change their mind, or lose interest. The friction of the waiver process loses people who might otherwise have served. Waivers are a valve, not a solution. They can adjust flow at the margins. They cannot fundamentally change the size of the pool. What this means: the eligibility crisis doesn't stay in recruiting offices. It flows downstream into the force. Ships sail undermanned. In December 2025, the Navy reported over 20,000 sailor gaps at sea. Not on paper, at sea. 63% of ship executive officers said they lacked enough sailors to complete basic maintenance. Undermanning leads to overwork. Overwork leads to fatigue. Fatigue leads to mistakes. The collision investigations after the USS Fitzgerald and the USS John S. McCain disasters in 2017 found crews running on minimal sleep, standing extra watches, skipping training. 17 sailors died. The Navy promised reforms: more sailors, better rest, stronger oversight. But the reforms depend on having enough people to implement them. And the recruiting pool keeps shrinking. The Army missed its recruiting goal by 25% in 2022 and 15,000 soldiers in 2023. It recovered in 2024 and 2025, largely because of the prep courses that now feed nearly a quarter of all enlistees. But the Inspector General found those courses cutting corners on medical oversight to push people through. The question no one wants to answer is this: what happens if the United States needs to fight a major war? The all-volunteer force works in peacetime. It works for rotational deployments and limited operations. But it depends on a sustainable pipeline of qualified people. If that pipeline breaks, if eligibility keeps declining and the population keeps shrinking, the math stops working. A former South Carolina Secretary of Veteran Affairs put it bluntly: if this trend continues, what we're going to have in future generations of an all-volunteer force is no force. 77% of Americans aged 17 to 24 cannot serve in the military. Not because they don't want to, not because recruiters failed, but because they don't meet the requirements. Requirements that exist for reasons of safety, capability, and readiness. 1 in 3 are too heavy. Millions have disqualifying medical or mental health conditions. Millions more have drug histories, criminal records, or test scores that bar them from service. And 44% face multiple disqualifiers at once. This isn't a recruiting crisis, it's an eligibility crisis. The military can't recruit its way out of obesity rates. It can't advertise its way past criminal records. It can't market its way through declining test scores. The problem isn't in the recruiting office. It's in the schools, the hospitals, the courts, and the homes where the next generation is growing up. By the time a young American walks into a recruiter's office, the question of whether they can serve has usually already been answered. The military doesn't have a recruiting problem. America has a readiness problem, and the ships still have to sail. If you want to understand what life looks like for the sailors who do make it through, how 5,000 people live and work on a $13 billion aircraft carrier, watch this video next.